So in this video, let's talk about Spring Cloud config. So basically it's a Spring Boot application. So before that, let's talk about like why we need this configuration server, right? So suppose in a distributed system, we have like multiple services and they are using some set of properties which are common across all services. Suppose if there is some change in that property, then again we have to go into the each and every microservice and we have to do the change, and again we have to redeploy and all those process we need to follow. So instead of doing that, what we can do, we can manage those set of properties externally. We can have them in our repository, for example GitHub repository, and from there we can use those. So by doing this, what advantage we will have is like we don't have to go into each and every microservice and do the change. So how all those services are going to get these properties from a central location? So for that we will be using configuration server. So Spring Cloud config, so it will fetch the properties from the repository and it will pass it on to my microservices. So when we start our microservices, they will go to this config server and they will ask for the properties, and they will have the properties and they can use those properties. Let's go ahead and create this configuration server. Also we will create this GitHub, and also we will integrate this configuration server into our microservices. So for group I will keep it Dev2Prod. The artifact I'll say config-server, and the package I will say config server. So for dependency we have to just type, so here you can see we have this config server dependency, so we will use this config server. That's it, generate. So let me import this project into my IDE. So now I have imported my configuration server in my IDE. So very first thing, we'll go to our main application class, config server application, and here we have to use one annotation called @enable config server. So by doing this, we are making this application as a configuration server. So this is the first thing. Second, let's go to our application properties. So the very first thing, I'll specify the port. So I want it to run on 8084. And second thing, we need to specify git URL from where this configuration server will fetch the properties. For that we have this property spring cloud config server.git.uri, and here we will pass the GitHub repository URL. So let's go ahead and first create our repository and then we can pass the URL here. Okay, so I have logged into my GitHub account. So let's create new repository. You can give any name. For now I'll keep everything and I'll just create the repository. So my repository is done. So this is my URL. So let me just copy paste it here. So now in this repository we have to create one file, application.properties. So this file application.properties will hold all those properties which are common in my microservices. Okay, so if I go back to my product service and see the properties file, so now here you can see we have couple of JPA properties and we have this data source driver class name. So these are like common in my product service as well as in my shopping cart service, right? So for now we have just few properties, but in real time we have lot of properties which are common across services. So whatever properties which are common, we will just move them to our application.property in my Git repo. So let me just copy paste it. So let me go ahead and just commit. So now we have application.properties. If we again go back to our properties file, so I have by mistake deleted these two properties, so I have added them back. So there are a couple of properties which are specific to my microservices, right? We cannot have them in our application.properties at common place, right? So what we can do is we can create another properties file specific to our microservices. So for that we need two things: the name of my application. So we have this property spring application name where we define the name for our service, right? And by this name only we see services getting registered on our Eureka server. So we will use the exact same name, product service. I will create another file. So I will use that name and I will say .properties, and in this property file we will pass those properties which are specific to our microservice. Okay, let me commit. Now we have these two files, right? One for application for common properties and one for product service where we have only this data source URL. So let me go back and just comment these things, whichever we are using from our repo now. So let's go ahead and start our config server. So now you can see our config server is started on 8084. Let's go back to our product service now. Okay, so in my product service, the very first thing what we have to do is we have to add the dependencies. So in my pom.xml, I'll add starter config service. After this, let's go back to our properties file. So here we need to tell this product service like where my config server is running. So the only property that we need to add is springcloud import, and this is the URL for my config server. So my config server is up and running on localhost and 8084. Only these two changes are required in product service. So now suppose whatever properties that we are getting from config server, right? So if those properties are not available, for example this data source URL and driver class name and all, so there will be issue with our service to get up, right? Okay, suppose the properties that you have maintained on your repository are not that mandatory. If those properties are not made available, you want your application to go, in that case you can use optional. So by making this optional, if the properties from config server is not available, still it will not fail. So for now let's keep it config server only. So we need these things from our config server. So let's boot product service. Before that, let me make my discovery service up and running. So let's go ahead and start our product service. Okay, so my service is up and running on 8081 port. If you see the logs, here you can see fetching configuration from server at this. So your configuration server is configured at this port and it is fetching those details. So this data source URL, driver class name, JPA related properties, it is fetching it from our repository. One more thing, to make a connection between our Git repository and our services, so we have to add the credentials, right? Without credentials, how our service will get the detail from GitHub, right? So for that, we can go to the files in settings. Under version control, you will see the GitHub. Okay. So I have already added my account here, right, where I have created my repository. So in the same way, you can also add your GitHub account details. It will use those credentials and it will make the connection with GitHub. Let's see a couple of other things around this configuration server. So suppose if I go back to this repository in the product service, I am adding one more property. So let me call it product.message. For now, I am using these properties. We can have YAML as well, so you can use that. So I'll say message from GitHub product properties files. Okay. If we add new properties in our repository, then how that property is going to be fetched in our microservices via config server. Let me go back to my product controller. So just for testing purpose, let me read that value here. So for that, I will be using @value annotation, and in this I will pass my key, which is this, and it will return me string message. Okay, I will just print this. So in the get products API, I will just want to print whatever value I am getting from my repo. So I'll say message from repo and I will print this. So let's try to restart our product service and see if we are able to get this message from our GitHub property file. So let me just restart this. Okay, let's try to hit that endpoint, which is get product. Okay, I can see the response. If I go back, yes, you can see. So we are getting this from our repo, and if you have noticed, we haven't started this configuration server, right? So every time when our application is up and running, it goes to the config server, and again config server fetches the latest, like whatever details are there from the GitHub repository. Now suppose what if I want to change this message? So how dynamically this property will be fetched, right? So we can do that as well. So for that, what we have to do is, so let me go back to our code. So here what we can do, we have to use one annotation called @refresh scope. Okay, so what this will do, it will just refresh the scope of my product controller. So we can use this annotation at class level only. So whatever values that we are getting from our configuration server and using in our product controller, so it will just refresh them. Basically it will fetch the latest details from the repo. Okay, so this is the first thing, and to use this we have to use actuators. So let me add that. So for actuators, we can use this dependency Spring Boot starter actuator. First thing. Second, in the properties file, we have to enable actuator endpoints, right? So for that, we have one property called management.endpoint.web.exposure.include. So we are basically allowing that refresh endpoint to be active. And second, we have to just disable the security. Okay, so by default it is true, so we have to make it false. Okay, else we will see 404 found error. So this is for security purpose. For now, just we are marking it as. So let's restart our product service. So basically with the help of these actuator endpoints, we can get the internal details of our microservice When I say internal information, that means details about our microservices, how our microservices are performing and all those things. So we can also see the status of our microservice. We can see a couple of informations and all. So let me show you that. So my service is up and running now. It is running on 8081. Let me go to my browser. Yes, in Eureka server we have product service up and running. If I go right now, we haven't configured any information, but if I click on actuators, you can see it returns a couple of information about beans and many more, right? For using that refresh endpoint, let me go ahead and try to hit our endpoint, product endpoint. Now if I go back to my ID console, here you can see message from repo is message from GitHub product properties file. So let me go ahead and change this. So I am making it new. So I am just changing the value, commit, and this time I am not going to restart my product service. So again in my Postman, if I go and hit, it will give me the same old value, right? Because that value is got cached, right? You can see this is the old value, not the new one. So let me hit that refresh endpoint. So this is my endpoint. So HTTP localhost running on 8081, the actuator and the refresh. Now since it is a post call, let me click on the post, and before hitting it, let's go to our product service application and I'll clean the console. And when I click on send, now here you can see again it is fetching configurations from our config server, right? So you can see it has fetched some details. If I go back to the endpoint, here you can see it returns two things, right? Config client version and the product message. So these are the two things which got updated or refreshed. So these are the two things it returned. And if I again go back to my Postman and try to hit the same endpoint, okay, I got success. If I go back, and now here you can see we have this new message, right? So these are like basic things that we can do around our configuration server. So this is pretty much about config server. So we have created config server, we have integrated it with GitHub, and also we have integrated our config server with the product service. So in the same way we can do it for the shopping cart as well. So for now I'll keep it to product service and I'll do the shopping cart in the later. You can get the code from my GitHub repository. That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.